It was the most ambitious expedition of its day. One of Britain's most renowned explorers, Sir John Franklin, and 133 officers and crew set off to conquer the most perilous waterway in the world. Their mission? To be the first to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific through Canada's icy Northwest Passage.
It felt as if it was the domain of death, the far limit of what human beings could do.
This was the holy grail of Arctic exploration, and it should have been the British Navy's ultimate achievement. But instead, two great ships with the best 19th century technology headed into the polar ice and seemed to vanish. For 150 years, the reason for the loss of the Franklin expedition remained a mystery. Now, a team of investigators has uncovered an extraordinary trail of clues that raises troubling new questions. Could it be that the men actually survived the ice, only to turn on each other?
I think this evidence is strongly suggestive of cannibalism among these Franklin crew members.
What was it that wiped out one of the most technologically advanced expeditions in 300 years of polar exploration? The story of the Franklin expedition can finally be told. Arctic Passage, Prisoners of the Ice, right now on Nova. Spring morning in 1845. At the offices of the British Admiralty, Sir John Franklin, a seasoned naval captain, receives final orders before setting off on a daring voyage of exploration.
Now, Sir John, this is the plan.
His destination, the Northwest Passage, one of the last unexplored waterways in the world, and perhaps the most perilous.
And then attempt to turn south or southwest into these uncharted waters. We have every faith in you, Sir John.
At this time, the only way to reach Asia is to make an arduous journey around Cape Horn, a trip that can take 6 months. The British believe that there is a shortcut, a passage through northern Canada that may shave months off the trip. But after 300 years of trying to penetrate the Arctic ice, no ship has ever sailed all the way through.
It's a puzzle, it's a matrix, like a maze. The winds are blowing the ice around, the currents are pushing the ice. And for a ship to traverse that was next to impossible.
This expedition will be the 19th attempt by the British Navy to punch through the passage. And this time, they're pulling out all the stops. John Franklin is one of Britain's most experienced Arctic explorers. At age 59, he may be too old for such a voyage, but finding the passage has been his lifelong dream, and his wife, Lady Jane Franklin, has given him her blessing.
South-southwest 30 degrees, please.
He and his second, Francis Crozier, another veteran explorer, will lead the largest and most technologically advanced Arctic expedition ever mounted. 134 men on board the Terror, and the Erebus, a pair of modified warships. Already among the sturdiest in the fleet, each has been radically altered for duty in the Arctic. Shipwrights reinforced their superstructures and added iron plates to the bow. They installed a locomotive steam engine, turning a screw-shaped propeller, a new invention that will allow the ships to power through the ice as never before.
You can sense the extraordinary confidence of people who'd pushed back the frontiers of nature through the glories of the Industrial Revolution, this might that they suddenly had at their disposal. And so they built up this force in two great ships reinforced by steel, and this would be their fortress.
Also on board, a new technology designed to eliminate the hunger and sickness that often plagued long voyages. A 19th century invention that promised to feed the men as if they were back in London. Canned food.
We will never starve again. It will nourish us through winter, spring, and summer.
On an earlier Arctic expedition, Franklin and his crew had to hunt and scavenge for nourishment.
Sir John, do tell us.
8 of them died of starvation, and he himself barely survived.
1819. We scraped lichen off rocks and boiled it up with scrag ends and bits of bones. Arctic pottage.
The story of his brush with death earned him a wry nickname, the man who ate his boots. But this time out, he intended to keep his shoe leather on his feet. So they loaded the ships with more than 30,000 pounds of fresh meat and vegetables, preserved in cans. This would be the first expedition to rely so completely on this revolutionary food source. Each night, Franklin and his officers could look forward to a proper meal, served at his well-appointed captain's table. And for the men, solid food and plenty of diversions, including an organ and a library of more than 1,000 books.
The great quantity of material may have seemed frivolous, but it was really a matter of survival. If you didn't give the men something to do, if you didn't keep them occupied, there was just no way they were going to survive the rigors of an extended Arctic voyage.
The two ships set sail from London in May of 1845. According to reports filed by Franklin in July, both ships made an uneventful crossing and docked in Greenland to take on additional supplies. From there, 5 men returned to England, and others posted letters home. A young lieutenant, James Fitzjames, wrote to his brother's family praising Franklin.
You have no idea how happy we all feel. We are very fond of Sir John. He is anything but nervous and fidgety. He is full of life and energy and kindness. We will toast his health when we reach the other side. Everyone believes we will make it through in a season, though I hope that we are forced to stay at least one winter in the ice.
On July 28, 1845, the expedition passed a British whaling ship as they headed into the passage. The captain of that vessel reported that Franklin's men were in high spirits, confident that they were about to make history. In the end, the expedition would be remembered, not for its discoveries, but for the disaster it would become when the ship sailed into the polar ice, never to return. When the first winter passed with no word from the men, the Admiralty was not worried. But when the second winter passed, Lady Jane Franklin began to urge the Royal Navy to send a search party.
Now, if an expedition were to leave this spring...
Franklin's superiors dismissed her concerns, believing that the men could survive for at least 3 years in the ice. But as the third winter approached, the Navy's confidence began to waver, And in 1848, the first of many search parties left England for the passage. The Royal Navy also offered the staggering sum of £20,000 for the rescue of the crew. By now, the apparent failure of the expedition was the talk of London, and it shocked Victorian England to the core. In 3 centuries of polar exploration, no expedition of this size had ever been lost. More than any other, this attempt should have succeeded. The men had every advantage. What could have happened? Were the ships crushed by the ice? Was the crew struck down by some disease? The Royal Navy even feared that the men might have been attacked by the Inuit, whom they viewed as savages. For 150 years, the cause of the disaster remained a mystery. But a century-old collection of artifacts, historical weather reports, and even forensic evidence are providing new clues.
It's amazing that we can tell this story at all. It's so fragmentary, the evidence so scattered. It's taken a tremendous amount of work, different people working in different disciplines to piece this puzzle together. And as we have done so, as the picture of what really happened has begun to emerge, we've realized what they couldn't. And that's that they were basically doomed from the start.
The first hint that the Franklin expedition carried the seeds of its own destruction was a discovery made in 1850 on Beechey Island, a rocky little outcropping just 300 miles into the passage. Today, there's a tiny Inuit community called Resolute nearby. But in Franklin's day, the area was an uninhabited wasteland. For historian Russell Potter, Beechey Island remains a vital link to the past and still holds important clues.
Ever since I first heard the Franklin story and just grasped the sense of the tragedy there, Beechey Island has been the magnet for me. The one place where you could stand and know that you were standing in Franklin's footsteps.
Today, he's making the long and difficult trip to the place where the abandoned remains of a campsite once stood.
They found signs that tents had been erected, a place where a smithy or anvil had been set up, even some attempt to build a garden up on the shingle.
As the first winter approached and the sea turned to ice, Franklin apparently anchored his ships at Beechey Island. The men then spread out onto the land, where they spent at least 7 months waiting for the summer thaw. Some of the telling items found at Beechey include hundreds of empty food cans, a chronometer, a pair of snow knives, and a pair of gloves, left out as if to dry in the sun. But searchers also found something disturbing: a row of graves belonging to 3 men who were members of Franklin's crew.
Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways.
Sitting here with these graves, we know they were here. Just a very, very haunting and haunted place.
The original headstones, which have since been replaced, did not note the cause of death, but the most common killer on long voyages was scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. However, the expedition carried 9,300 pounds of lemon juice to ward off the disease, leaving historians to wonder if some new killer was at work. Something that could have caused the loss not only of these 3 men, but of the entire expedition.
At Beechey Island, you have the remains of 3 members of the expedition, and almost certainly preserved remains, so that this opens the possibility of understanding the medical reasons behind the disaster.
No modern investigator examined the graves until 1984, when the Canadian government gave permission to a team of forensic scientists to exhume the bodies. The scientists hoped that the corpses would be well preserved by the ice. But nothing prepared them for what they uncovered.
It was such a profoundly moving experience, and also one of shock, really, or amazement that these sailors from the last century, there they were. You could see their eyelashes, you could see their eye color, you can get a sense almost of the personality of these characters. It's as if they had stepped forward in time to sort of answer very important questions that needed to be asked.
At the gravesite, the forensic team performed autopsies and discovered that the men had died of tuberculosis. It was a common and deadly disease of the day, but not virulent enough to wipe out the entire crew. To Franklin, the loss of these young men may have been upsetting, but not necessarily alarming. For a group of this size traveling through such harsh conditions, cut off from civilization, some loss of life was nearly inevitable. If anything, the large number of empty food cans found at the campsite suggested that most of the men were surviving and had made it safely through that first winter. But searchers were puzzled by the number of usable items left behind. It suggested that the men had departed suddenly. What could have caused them to abandon the camp in a hurry? Perhaps they had no choice.
If there's any explanation to why Franklin had to take off so quickly without leaving any notes behind, the ice was maybe blown tight against Beechey Island, and he was waiting and waiting. And then, all of a sudden, the winds turned around, and the ice moved off to the south. If he saw that one opening, he wanted to grab it right away. That was his escape.
The ice would have been their main worry. So the minute he had the opportunity, Franklin would have hoisted anchor and headed deeper into the passage. And that's where later expeditions made a series of troubling discoveries. Evidence that Franklin and his men had become stuck once more in the ice. John Graves has a unique window on the Franklin mystery. He oversees a collection of Franklin artifacts recovered from the Arctic, now preserved at the National Maritime Museum in London. This mysterious trail of personal effects once lay scattered over hundreds of miles of ice and snow, and were recovered throughout the 1850s.
It was this succession of search expeditions that went out to the Arctic looking for Franklin and his crew. Little by little, they started to bring back some of the artifacts you see here. And basically, it's all we have really to try and piece together what happened to Franklin and his men.
The first group of items in the collection were discovered by Dr. John Ray in 1854. He was a Scottish explorer on a surveying mission. Traveling overland, he encountered a group of Inuit who had in their possession several small objects that Ray realized must have belonged to the missing expedition.
They include these two pieces from a telescope, a small wooden container, this brass match case, a pocket knife with a bone handle, and this small leather working tool.
This wasn't cast-off garbage like most of the debris found at Beechey Island. These were personal items that Franklin's men would not have discarded willingly.
These items recovered from the Inuit was the first hint that something terrible had happened to the Franklin expedition.
The Inuit told Ray that they had seen ships trapped in the ice and white men on foot walking south. But Ray couldn't figure out where they'd seen the men. They had no maps, and their directions seemed vague. But that wasn't the worst of it. The Inuit also told Ray that some of the men had turned to what they called the last resource: cannibalism. In Britain, the report was not well received.
The Admiralty frankly refused to believe the Inuit testimony. It was thinking the unthinkable, basically. and so subsequent search expeditions were dispatched to try and uncover the truth.
By the time of Ray's discovery, almost 10 years had passed since Franklin left England. The Admiralty had privately concluded that there was no hope of ever finding survivors. But Lady Jane Franklin remained determined, and she financed search parties of her own. Then, in 1858, Leopold McClintock, one of the men she hired to search for her husband, landed on King William Island, where he and his men made two important discoveries. The first, an abandoned boat. The boat had been mounted on a sled and was rigged with harnesses for pulling by the men. It was loaded with equipment and personal effects, and a pair of skeletons. The second find lay 20 miles farther up the coast of the island, a written note, protected by a metal can, and placed inside a carefully constructed pile of stones called a cairn. A single page that gave haunting testimony as to the fate of the men.
It began with the standard Admiralty form and the message, "All well, Sir John Franklin commanding."
It was dated May of 1847, and it noted that the ships had been stuck in the ice since September of 1846. The current position was given as 70 degrees north, 98 degrees west, the northern tip of King William Island. Apparently, this is where the expedition had ground to a halt. Franklin had probably sailed west from Beachy for about 75 miles before turning south into a channel called Peel Sound, which led to King William Island. For Franklin, these were uncharted waters, but he and the Royal Navy believed that this route to the south was the key to the passage. Peel Sound opens into a network of channels that eventually leads all the way to the Bering Strait and the Pacific Ocean.
To Franklin, that would have been a very, very tempting route to take, particularly if it was open, free of ice. And Peel Sound, we know today, is very, very changeable from year to year. One year it can be completely wide open, another year it can be choked up with ice so that it's impassable even by modern ships.
What Franklin didn't know is that polar ice funnels down from the north through what is now called McClintock Channel, eventually piling up at the southern end of Peel Sound. Franklin couldn't see that icy impasse when he turned south, but once he ran into it, he may have been unable to escape.
At the bottom end, at the south end of Peel Sound, is where he runs into that huge stream of Arctic Ocean polar ice that is probably where he met his demise.
At the south end of Peel Sound, the ice may simply have outflanked the Erebus and the Terror. At least that's what an addition to the note found on King William Island indicated.
Around that message in the margins was written a second, far more disturbing message.
Dated 1848, more than a year after the original note was written. Francis Crozier, the captain of the Terror, added in the margin that the ships were still trapped in the ice, in the same location. They hadn't moved in nearly 2 years. What had gone wrong? Usually the polar ice melts during the summer. Could it be that this time the ice simply didn't melt?
The nightmare scenario is that I'm never going to get out of this ice. I'm facing another long winter. It's going to get dark. It's going to get very cold. And here I am out on the ice that's still moving around. I don't know where this ice is carrying me.
No previous polar expedition had ever reported a summer so cold that the ice didn't break up. That anomaly puzzled polar scientist Roy Kerner. Recently, he set out to learn just what kind of weather Franklin had to contend with during that fateful year. Kerner and his team regularly drilled down into the Arctic ice cap, retrieving samples that they can use to understand temperature patterns from other eras. At most latitudes, ice is impermanent. But north of the Arctic Circle, it tends to hang around, even for thousands of years. Kerner retrieved a sample from more than 100 meters below the surface. By counting ice layers and by analyzing the chemical content of the core, he zeroed in on a section that he could date back to the late 1840s. He hoped it might be able to tell him more about the conditions that Franklin's men faced.
The reason ice cores give the history of the climate in the past is that everything that happens on the surface is preserved as the ice gets buried. If the surface of the snow melts, the water percolates down and it forms these ice layers. The more it melts, the more ice layers and the thicker the ice layers.
Kerner found that within the 1840s ice core, there was simply no sign of the transparent ice layers that form when snow melts. Kerner had once before seen another ice core like this, dated from the early 1970s. In that case, he had actual weather reports to compare it to, and he learned that the ice from the 70s had formed during a very cold period of almost permanent winter.
The point to make on this core is the absolute near absence of any signs of melting whatsoever. None of those clear layers at all. Just bubbly ice that is formed from compression of snow that doesn't melt in the summer.
The finding convinced him that Franklin faced similar conditions, when much of the sea ice had not melted at all. For an expedition hoping to sail the passage with 19th century technology, the conditions would have been deadly.
If it's a cold summer, that ice isn't going to go out and open up. The channels are ice infested still. The ships that they used in those days, they don't have the power to get through even modest ice.
Kerner's evidence confirmed that Franklin and his men had encountered freak weather conditions, more severe than previous explorers had reported. Worse than that, Kerner's ice core showed that this period of extreme cold likely lasted for 5 long years. This terrible run of bad luck trapped the men in the wilderness. But there was even worse news. Also written in the margin of the note, another entry read, Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. It continued, the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. They were still living on their ships and probably had plenty of food, but a mysterious killer now stalked their ranks.
They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul melteth away because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man.
It's clear from everything we know he was a beloved commander. He'd been in the Arctic before and only one other officer had.
And he bringeth them out of
I think that his presence was a tremendous reassurance to everyone there, and his loss would have been a terrific blow.
So that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad, because they are quiet.
Sir John Franklin died even before the first search expeditions left England. In that year, Lady Jane continued to write poignant letters to her missing husband, unaware that she was already a widow.
I desire nothing but to cherish the remainder of your days, however injured and broken your health may be. I live in you, my dearest.
Three years after the expedition left England, the commander and 20% of the 128-man crew lay dead. Already it was one of the deadliest disasters in the history of polar exploration. The final entry on the note said that the men had abandoned the safety of their ships and were now walking south. In that brief note, Second-in-Command Francis Crozier testified to a terrible truth. The expedition lay in ruins, and the chances of anyone getting out alive were rapidly fading.
The whole plan for traversing the Northwest Passage depended on being able to sail through it. They didn't have a plan for getting away except by sailing out. They didn't have, for example, lightweight sledges adapted to the terrain. All they had was what was on the ship, that lavish factory full of Victorian contrivances and good ideas.
The boat they'd converted into a sled was filled with the crew's personal possessions. As it was later found by a search party led by Leopold McClintock, it's estimated to have weighed a staggering 1,400 pounds. After 3 years marooned in the Arctic, dying one by one, their overland escape attempt must have been an act of desperation. The nearest outpost lay 600 miles to the south. A daunting distance to travel by foot, especially with so much gear in tow.
This boatload of strange relics of Victorian culture. The Vicar of Wakefield prayer books, New Testament in French, carpet slippers, chocolate, tea, button polishers, buttons, silver plate and utensils. All of the detritus of this, inner culture of the ships that they tried to take with them.
You can imagine these people desperately wanting to carry their precious world with them, but everything they trusted was now going to become not an advantage, but a problem, so that they were burdened now by their numbers, they were burdened now by the weight of their stores, and above all, burdened by the fact that they didn't know what to do with the land that they were now suddenly totally dependent on.
It would have been murderously difficult to haul such a heavy load through the snow. At some point, they apparently abandoned it on the west coast of King William Island. And it's there that the trail of clues runs out.
Based on this trail of evidence, the Admiralty decided that Franklin's men had simply starved to death trying to walk out of the wilderness. And for more than a century, that was the official narrative. But there were eyewitnesses, as it turns out, people who actually saw Franklin's men in this last extremity. And their story is quite different from the official Admiralty version.
In 1869, an American journalist, Charles Francis Hall, found these eyewitnesses when he spent 5 years in the Canadian Arctic, often living with Inuit families.
Did you ask him where these people came from, what direction they were walking from?
He met dozens of indigenous people who retained detailed memories of Franklin's crew and their ships. Hall carefully recorded their testimony, but once again, it was discounted by the British, who considered the Inuit to be unreliable. Russell Potter has made a new study of Hall's notebooks, digging them out of an archive at the Smithsonian where they'd been hidden away for more than 100 years.
Hall was just a very diligent man. He trusted the Inuit. He believed in their stories. He carefully corroborated one story with another to try to see how accurate that was likely to be. It matches very well with the physical evidence we have. It really is a highly accurate and amazingly well-preserved oral tradition.
The Inuit told of an abandoned camp, a tent place, as Hall translated it. And it was a grisly sight.
And they gave him a very vivid description of this place. They had seen tents on the land, bodies inside the tents, abandoned equipment.
The Inuit placed the location of the camp somewhere on King William Island, the same island where the abandoned boat and the note had been discovered. They described the bodies they saw there. They said that the faces were black, a symptom of frostbite. They also said that the insides of the men's mouths were black as well. And that could only mean one thing. 3 years into their Arctic journey, scurvy was ravaging the men. The British Navy had long known that lemon juice could stave off the disease. But what they didn't know is that the active ingredient, vitamin C, loses its potency over time. By 1848, the men would have begun to suffer the terrible effects of the disease.
The first symptoms of scurvy are a general lassitude and a weakness, and it mainly affects the gums. They become swollen, they become purple. The slightest touch means they bleed very, very easily. As it develops, the bleeding goes on everywhere. You can get bleeding into your eyes, you get bleeding into your muscles, and this is particularly painful. The main muscle that you're using to try and pull this sledge through the snow, and you've got this agonizing bleeding into the muscles and into the joints, so it would have just slowly but horrendously killed them.
The men would have recognized the symptoms of scurvy, but they wouldn't have recognized the symptoms of an even more insidious illness that may have been affecting them. While performing autopsies on the 3 young sailors buried on Beechey Island, the investigators also removed hair and bone tissue for later analysis. In a Canadian laboratory, scientists found something surprising in those samples. Levels of lead, 6 to 10 times higher than normal. Enough to cause severe lead poisoning. Where did it come from? Some suggested that the lead levels could have been caused by the industrial air pollution of Victorian England. But Anne Keenleyside, a Canadian anthropologist, decided to examine the evidence from a new angle. First, Keenleyside's test confirmed the extraordinary levels of lead in the bodies.
They were so high that these individuals would have almost certainly been suffering from serious physiological and neurological problems.
Then, using a process called X-ray fluorescence, she discovered the lead concentration was higher in soft, spongy bones than in other places in the body. It was a vital clue, because soft bones, like the vertebrae, regenerate themselves every few years.
These individuals were exposed to this lead over a fairly recent period of time before their death. So this was short-term exposure from some source on the expedition.
Based on her finding, researchers took another look at the clues found at Beechey. They found that the food cans had been sealed with solder, a soft metal compound that contains lead. Chemical analysis showed that the lead in the cans matched the lead found in the bodies.
There's like a fingerprint that was found in the bodies, in the organs, in the tissues, in the bone, and that was the smoking gun.
Apparently, the lead had contaminated the food, causing lead poisoning, a deadly illness. Symptoms include fatigue, confusion, and paranoia. Not enough by itself to cause death, but if the men were weakened by illness, the poison would have been a devastating complication.
When you combine lead and scurvy, you suddenly have this tag team undermining the health of the crewmen. It really was a recipe for a mass disaster.
And the key ingredient in that recipe? The very technology that was meant to keep them alive.
We will never starve again. It will nourish us through winter, spring, and summer.
In the autumn of 1848, the fourth winter in the Arctic, the window for escape was rapidly closing. As the men became weakened by hunger and disease, the bonds between them began to unravel.
It's clear from the Inuit testimony that at this point the traditional discipline is beginning to break down. The men are separating into different groups, possibly hostile to one another. Some are heading back to the ships, some camped on the land, some walking out by their own directions. None of them under the traditional central command that the Navy would expect. It's really the beginning of the end for them. Everyone is trying to find their own solution.
That breakdown in morale was starkly apparent from Inuit testimony, describing an incident that took place on one of the ships still trapped in the ice off the coast of King William Island. An elderly woman reported to Hall that a man from her village had come upon a group of survivors on board that vessel.
The Inuit went to the ship all alone. He said there were men there. He said they had black faces, black hands, black clothes on, were black all over. This Inuit was very alarmed because they would not let him get away. Then a captain came out of the cabin and put a stop to it.
Leave him!
Then the captain took this Inuit down with him into his cabin.
There is a tent.
He told him to look over to the land, where there are men living in a big tent. He said neither the Inuit nor any of his people must ever go there.
You must not go there. You must go. 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 Do not come here.
The Inuit were not told why some of the men were living separately. But in 1994, human bone fragments discovered on King William Island suggested one chilling possibility. Anne Keenleyside tested these bones as well and found that they also contained lead from the food supply, linking them to the Franklin expedition. Then she examined the surface of the bones under a powerful electron microscope.
We saw very distinct cut marks. These were quite different from animal tooth marks. These looked like very definite cut marks, as if they were made by some kind of a knife or metal blade.
Keenleyside then plotted the pattern of the cut marks on a skeleton.
A lot of the cuts were located in the vicinity of the joints, some of the bones that would have been covered by a lot of flesh or soft tissue. We also found cuts, interestingly, in the bones of the hands and feet. And the hands and feet are probably the most human aspects of the body apart from the face. And the fact that we were finding cuts in those locations suggested to me that perhaps these individuals were intentionally removing those more human aspects of the body. I think this evidence is strongly suggestive of cannibalism among these Franklin crew members. I don't see any other possible explanation that would account for those cut marks.
Keenleyside's tests finally corroborated the Inuit accounts of cannibalism, recorded both by the Scottish surveyor John Ray and the American journalist Charles Hall. The same testimony despised and discounted by the British for over a century. According to other Inuit eyewitnesses, not all of the men stayed on or near the ships. In Hall's records are the words of two elderly Inuit called Takita and Owa, who described an encounter with a small band of men walking south on the polar ice.
We were out sealing when we saw something on the ice. As they drew nearer, we realized it was white men. They asked us for food.
Can you help us? We need food. Yes, we...
The officer also signaled that two ships lay in the ice to the north.
We have two ships.
Then he made a motion of falling sideways, whistling and blowing.
They're stuck.
It was the sound of a ship being crushed in the ice.
They're broken. We're very hungry.
The Inuit stayed for the night and gave the men some seal meat. But they were on a hunting expedition and had to leave the next day.
Early next morning we set off. The leader tried to make us stop, but we were in a hurry and did not know the man was starving.
Stop! Stop! Stop!
Inuit simply packed up and left. And when you think about it, that seems like a terrible thing, but it's really an act of self-preservation. There's no way that a small band of Inuit, even the most skilled hunters, could have kept alive 30 starving men in the middle of that landscape. There just wasn't enough food even for their own families. They didn't really have any choice.
In recent years, a few skeletal remains have turned up along a 30-mile stretch of King William Island. These bones tell the grim tale of what may have happened to those who never gave up trying to walk to safety. At first, they buried their dead in makeshift graves. But then, weakened by cold and hunger, the rest simply died and were found where they fell. After such a long struggle, when death finally came, it may have felt like a welcome release.
In the Arctic, you feel like the elements are not passive. You feel like you're involved in some malevolent force. When you experience extreme cold for the first time, it's like a glove closing around you. You feel like you don't want to fight. You want to give in. You want to close down your senses. After a time, it's almost as if the cold has seeped through to your heart. And I don't mean your physical heart, I mean your soul, your very being, because you feel like no longer fighting. And once you've given up that fight, and you just want to sleep, you just want to become part of that oblivion.
The final report in Hall's notes came from an Inuit hunter who claimed to have found 4 white men half dead on the ice, sometime around 1851. He sheltered them for the winter. When the spring came, they gave him an officer's sword as a gesture of thanks. Then they said goodbye and headed for home, never to be seen again. Piece by piece throughout the 1850s, news of the relics uncovered by the search parties made its way back to Britain. In 1859, 14 years after Franklin left England, the search was officially called off. Lady Franklin never gave up her hope that some members of the expedition may have survived, even though she had learned from the note that her husband was dead.
What secrets may be hidden within those wrecked or stranded ships, we know not. What may be buried in the graves of our unhappy countrymen, or in caches not yet discovered, we have yet to learn, and thus left in ignorance and darkness, with so little obtained. Can it be fitting to pronounce that the fate of the expedition has been ascertained?
For years, historians and scientists have searched for clues to the fate of the Franklin expedition. And at last, their evidence taken together offers a plausible answer to this enduring mystery. After sailing south through Peel Sound, Franklin's men became trapped in the ice off King William Island. They tried to walk south to safety, but exposure, lead poisoning, and scurvy crippled them. Those who could made it back to the ships to wait for rescue that never came. Another group camped nearby, possibly ostracized from their brethren for having resorted to cannibalism. 2 years later, some Inuit encountered a group of 30 men walking south. These men died one by one along the coast of King William Island. Finally, after 6 years lost in the Arctic, 4 men were still trying to make it home when they encountered a group of Inuit.
I think it's fairly clear that this expedition just wasn't prepared for some of the things that could happen. They hadn't planned to hunt or live off the land. They didn't have any provision for doing so. They had made a lot of assumptions about what would work and how they would get through, and they were extraordinarily optimistic assumptions, as it's turned out. I think that's what makes it so tragic.
Britain's hopes of being first to sail all the way through the polar ice died with Sir John Franklin and his crew. But the lost expedition did help to complete the map of the Arctic. Franklin's trail led search parties into uncharted waters that turned out to be the long-sought link between the Atlantic and the Pacific, finally proving the existence of the Northwest Passage.
On NOVA's website, retrace the Arctic Passage expeditions on our interactive map, explore a history of cannibalism, build an igloo online, and more. Find it on pbs.org.